Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have an 11-game Major League Baseball slate. Before I get started, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? It really does help the channel a lot. We really do appreciate it. Also share it on social media if you don't mind. With that said, let's get into the slate. So before I get into the slate a whole lot, I do have some core plays here on DraftKings and FanDuel. So Valdez, a pitcher, Kirk, a catcher, Lowe, a second baseman, Bichette, shortstop, and Varsho at outfielder. And on FanDuel, we have Lowe, Bichette, and Springer as my core plays. This slate is full of teams that are projected to score 4.5 runs. Toronto, St. Louis, Boston, Tampa Bay, Houston, Atlanta, New York Yankees, and LA Dodgers all projected over 4.5 runs in Vegas. That's quite a lot of teams. There's also just there's a mishmash of good pitchers and bad pitchers today. Obviously, we're going to prioritize the good pitchers here, to use in DraftKings and FanDuel. I'll also mention that there's quite a bit of value play as a result of these matchups, and so that does help a lot here, though there are some high-end guys that obviously would be fun to roster if possible, but there's enough value pretty much at every position with the exception of second at base and maybe shortstop, where you can pretty much roster mostly who you want on this slate. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started in it. As for weather, the most obvious game that's going to have an influence is Toronto and Kansas City. That game does seem to have some pretty severe weather when it comes to wind, and what I mean by that is it's going to be blowing 25 miles per hour or more out to left, which is going to have a lot of potential for good home run hits, and so I definitely look at them as one of the top two teams to look at from a fantasy perspective. So with that said, we've got some good options though across the board at every position, so let's go ahead and get started in it. First of all, we're going to get at the pitchers. Now, we're going to start with talking about Max Scherzer, who is obviously the most expensive pitcher on this slate on DraftKings. He had 17 out of 24 games last season where he scored at least 20 fantasy points on DraftKings, and he had 35 versus Milwaukee in the one game he played against them last year. He also leads pitchers in K rate and is projected around 7 to 8 strikeouts, which is most on the slate. Should be a top pick option as a no-brainer. However, he is a little bit riskier because he's got one of the tougher matchups against Milwaukee. He's actually a decent hitting team, but because a lot of the other good pitchers are going against weak opponents, and so that while he does have that upside, he is a little bit risky from that perspective, and there's some value, a little bit cheaper plays that are just as good as him with a much easier opponent. So he is definitely worth the consideration. He's got good stuff, obviously, but he is a little bit riskier simply because of the matchup. We're going to look at Framber Valdez here now for Houston, and he's the best value play, I think, like when it comes to under 10,000 play here. I don't say necessarily value, but he's a pretty consistent pitcher. He's got big-time upside versus a really bad team here. He also gets a lot of strikeouts, and he's priced down a little bit more than Bieber and Urias, who don't get quite as many strikeouts as him. So he becomes a very good play on the slate, and I do think he's a core play against a really easy matchup for him, a team that he should be able to do well against. He also gets a lot of strikeouts, which also gives him some advantage. We're also going to look at Luis Castillo for Seattle against the Angels. Now, he's not as consistent as the top two that I already mentioned, but he has some upside in this matchup. He should get a decent amount of Ks versus a team who does tend to strike out decently. Now, they aren't striking out this season so far as much as they did last year, but he still has some utility here, and he's a little bit cheaper even, and that makes him a good alternative option. Shane Bieber, also very interesting here for Cleveland. He's got a best matchup against Oakland, who really hasn't been good except for the one game yesterday. But I look for him to be pretty dominant in this game. He's got good upside. He's got pretty good strikeout stuff here as well. And he should have a good opportunity to have a big game here, though he's just as expensive as Scherzer nearly. Then, last but not least, we're going to look at Urias for the Dodgers. Now, he's going against Colorado, which is a nice matchup for him. Obviously, with this game being at the Dodgers Stadium, that's a lot better than being in Colorado. He doesn't have the K rate that the other guys I've mentioned do have, but he's a good contrarian option on the slate, and he's a little bit cheaper than Scherzer and Bieber, though he's a little bit more expensive than Valdez and Castillo. Now, all right, let's get to the catchers here, and we're going to start with Alejandro Kirk. Now, I thought about just using one catcher here only, but I do have a couple guys for you to consider. Kirk is the top play on the slate. He's $3,400, way too cheap for his potential in this matchup. he's got a great matchup. Toronto should score a lot of runs, and he's got a good situation here. He hasn't started the season particularly great, but he is in a top tier spot. He does have home run potential in a catcher. That's usually what we're looking for. And so he's a great matchup, and he's also just too cheap for his potential in this one. But we are going to take a look at Salvador Perez as well. He obviously has hit the ball extremely well to start the season, and if you can afford to pay up, then he's worth taking a look. He has big potential here, but he is high price, so it is a consideration. It's a little bit of risk. He's better priced on FanDuel, which he's got a lot more utility there, but he does have some good utility here as well. Then I'm also going to mention Danny Jansen for Toronto. If for some reason Kirk wasn't to play today, then Jansen would potentially be a top tier option. But also Jansen could also play because sometimes they DH one of them. And so I look for him to be a decent play as well. And he's also just very cheap and a good way to pay down at catcher if you want, who has some potential for home runs. I do have two other guys I am going to mention here, though, in Wilson Contreras for St. Louis and Travis d'Arnaud for Atlanta. Both these two guys have some good upside in these matchups against pitching that they've done well against in the past. And so I do think they have some utility, but they're not must-plays by any stretch of imagination. I just wanted to mention them in passing. Then we're going to go ahead at first base here, and we're going to start with Paul Goldschmidt, who's just got the best upside on the slate when it comes to expensive guys. He's on the second highest scoring team on the slate. He's got a great matchup here, and he's got home run potential. He started the season off really well. He hit a home run yesterday as well, so that gives him a lot of, obviously he's going to be attractive today. He was kind of close to being a core play if Toronto wasn't so well supported today. Vlad Guerrero Jr. for Toronto is a good alternative to Paul Goldschmidt. I don't really like his metrics in this matchup as much as I like Goldschmidt's, outside of the fact that it's just going to be a home run haven where he could go off. But he's going to be a very popular play today, and he's definitely worth taking a look at. Freddie Freeman is also a lower end upside play in this price range. Just a good alternative for, just take your pick between the three. All of them have home run potential in these matchups. For a couple of cheaper options, Joey Menendez for Washington. He's got some weird upside here today, though he is pretty expensive. He hasn't started the season particularly well. He does have home run potential as kind of a secondary play. Nate Lowe also in a good spot here. I do tend to like him when the situation is right for Texas, and this is definitely a situation where he has some potential. He didn't do very well yesterday, but he's had a couple of decent games so far this season, so I look for him to have a good game here against Baltimore and probably be a kind of a sneaky play almost. And then I do have kind of a Hail Mary play for you in Luke Raley who can also play outfielder for Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay just looks like they have a really good opportunity here to have a big game. Now, he had 2 home runs yesterday, and he might have some more usage today than you'd expect because he's kind of a streaky player, but he is definitely worth taking a look at from a Hail Mary perspective. At second base, we're going to start with Brandon Lowe, who I just think didn't have a good game yesterday, but he's going to have a good opportunity again today. Tampa Bay is going to be a high-scoring team again, and I think that he'll probably be one of the leaders of this team today versus yesterday. How that kind of happens. Some days you have one guy, a couple different guys hit home runs, and then the next day, if you're in the same kind of good matchup, then you have 2 different guys hit home runs, and he kind of feels like that today. He's got a great situation. Whit Merrifield, also very interesting today, can also play outfield if you want. For Toronto, he's going to have some upside in this matchup. Obviously, pretty much everybody on Toronto feels pretty good today, but he's got good upside in this one, and he's got good hitting potential here. And he's also cheap, and that's going to be beneficial to building a roster where we get guys that we can roster. Ozzie Albies is a good secondary play. He's a little bit more expensive, a little bit overpriced, but he does have potential here. He's hitting the ball extremely well so far. He even hit a home run yesterday. I don't necessarily expect a home run, but I do think he can get 10 to 12 fantasy points, especially if he can get a steal or something like that as well. And then Gleyber Torres for New York Yankees. He started the season just extremely good. I don't know if they just juiced the balls in New York, but if they did, then he's definitely somebody to take into consideration. He does check out as a good offensive play, a good play on the slate, though he is fairly expensive, just like Albies is. But, if you have the money to pay up and you want to pay up at second base, those are the two guys that I would take a look at. At third base, we're going to look at Rafael Devers. Obviously, he hit a home run yesterday. He's hitting .421 for the season so far, averaging over 13 fantasy points a game. He looks like a really solid play, just extremely expensive, really hard to roster on a slate like this, but he's definitely worth taking a look at. Austin Riley is also in a similar situation, has high-end potential. He does have home run potential here. He's got a nice plus matchup, and while he hasn't been as good as Devers has so far, he is looking to have a big year, and he's definitely in consideration as a top-tier option on the slate. And Nolan Arenado, also very good on this slate here for St. Louis. Hasn't hit a home run yet. He's kind of due, and this is the kind of situation where you like to potentially draw him up. Then Matt Chapman, he's a little bit cheaper here. He clocks in as a value play on the slate because of his price being so much cheaper. He's hitting a ridiculous .533 so far this season in these first 4 games, hitting very well. He's had 3 games over 11 fantasy points. He's just a little bit too cheap for his potential here, especially in a nice plus matchup against Kansas City as one of the top teams on the slate. Then I have 2 Yankees players I just wanted to mention, and DJ LeMahieu and Josh Donaldson. Both these guys have some upside in this matchup. It feels like that the Yankees are just hitting the ball extremely well right now. I don't know if it's because the balls are juiced there for home runs for Judge, but these 2 guys have taken advantage of it so far, and so they're definitely worth in consideration here at third base. If you want to pay down, they're definitely good ways to do it. Then we're looking at shortstop, and we're just going to take a look at Bo Bichette here to start. Bo Bichette, I've been waiting for him to be at the top of the leaderboard when it comes to home run potential and everything, and this is the game where it hits. He also hit a home run yesterday. I expect this Toronto-Kansas City game to be high scoring, and I look for him to be a great play on this slate. He's got good upside here, and he is pretty fun to roster when he hits those potentials because he tends to have big, he usually doesn't just get 14 fantasy points, he usually gets more. So I really do like him on this matchup. But if you want an alternative to him, O'Neal Cruz is as good of anybody on this particular slate. He's got some good upside here, somewhat riskier because his price is so high, but if you can afford him, he has home run potential against a pitcher who he should be able to hit pretty well. Then we're going to look at some more cheap plays here, and Tommy Edman at St. Louis, he looks like a really good play today against Atlanta. He's had some ups and downs so far this season, but he's had a hit in every game, and he'll probably get you some fantasy points. Obviously, if we can pay up for Bichette here, it's definitely going to be the best opportunity, but he's a good, solid, cheap option on the slate. Then I have 2 value plays, and Espanyol for Toronto. He's kind of a high-risk, high-reward Hail Mary option here, and Taylor Walls, also kind of a high-risk Hail Mary option for Tampa Bay, but I think both of them carry some potential and stackability on their teams as good value options to help you pull other guys in if you want that at that position. As for the outfield, we're going to start with Varsho being a value play. He's a little bit cheaper than I expected him to be today. He hasn't started the season particularly great when it comes to batting average, but he is still managing to get some fantasy points in some of these games, and I look for him to have home run potential in this matchup, especially in a game where all the metrics fall in his favor. As for top-tier play options, Aaron Judge obviously has hit the ball extremely well so far this season. He's 2 for 4 when it comes to home runs, when it comes to games, and he's hit one every other game, and if he can continue that today, that would mean he'd hit one, and if he did that, then, well, he'd become a great play on the slate. He's a little bit risky since of his price, but he is definitely somebody to consider here. George Springer, he feels very close to a core play today, but he's a little bit hard to roster at his price point simply because of the way these slate has laid out. But he's $1,500 cheaper than Judge or Acuna, and he has just as much upside as they do. Definitely worth a look if you can fit him in. A little bit of a cheaper option is Tyler O'Neill, who is still pretty expensive here on DraftKings, but he has played well so far this season. I expect him to have home run potential in this matchup against Atlanta. Obviously, Alex Verdugo has played very well to start the season, and I do think he has some nice Verdugo has some nice upside in this matchup against Pittsburgh. He's actually been over 10 fantasy points in all 4 games so far, and he's hitting a ridiculous 421. That's not going to continue throughout the season, but he is in a good spot right now. Lane Thomas, also very interesting today, has some nice upside. I really think that he's got more upside today than people want to think. He's hitting the ball pretty well so far, and even in this games where he didn't get the hits, he flew out or whatever, the hits looked really good. And aside from the first Tampa Bay game where he had 2 strikeouts, he's really made contact well, and so I do think he's a very good option as a cheaper play to consider on the slate. Then we're going to look at Franmil Reyes for Kansas City. I do really like Kansas City today. He's a good value play here at a pretty inexpensive price. He's a top-tier matchup here as well, and he has had success in the past. He hasn't started the season particularly well, but he's only played 2 games. He did get walked a couple times, so I do think he's got some upside in this matchup. And then I got 2 Hail Mary plays here in Jose Siri for Tampa Bay, who is pretty cheap and has some utility here as Tampa Bay has some good upside when it comes to being a stackable team, and that would also include Luke Raley, who hit 2 home runs yesterday. So with that said, guys, that's what I have for DraftKings. Let's go over to FanDuel now, and we're going to start off with our pitchers. I do have some core plays in here in Lowe, Bichette, and Springer, but when we look at our catchers here, and first baseman, our pitchers rather. Max Scherzer strikes me as a top tier option here. He's higher risk than Valdez, but he's got the best K rate on the state, and that definitely gives him some upside here. And he had a really good game against Miami in the first game, but he has the toughest matchup against Milwaukee. Then Framber Valdez, he's the cheapest option, I think, that's viable here. We do want our pitcher to get 50 fantasy points today, and one of these 4 guys will likely do it that I have listed. And Valdez is the cheapest of them, and he has almost as much K upside as anybody on the slate, and so he definitely has some good opportunity here to be a good play. Then we'll look at Shane Bieber for Cleveland. Now he's the most expensive play here on FanDuel rather, and if he can get over 50 fantasy points, he'll definitely be worth taking a look here. He's got a good matchup against a team that we definitely like, considering the fact that Oakland has not been very good to start the season, with the exception of the 1 game yesterday. But I expect him to be a really good option on the slate. And then Julio Urias. It's going to be hard to decide which of these 4 to utilize. Urias is probably the weakest, simply because he doesn't have the strikeout rate that the other 3 have. But is a little bit harder for him to get to 50 fantasy points. That we do want one of these 4 guys to get to pay off for us, because I do feel like one of them will, and it's just hard to figure out which one will. But Urias is a good contrarian option if you want to kind of take a little bit riskier approach, going up against a team that has high strikeout potential, but he doesn't have a big strikeout rate typically. So he is definitely useful on the slate, though. From the catching perspective and first baseman, we're going to start with Vlad Jr. He obviously has a great matchup here for Toronto against Tampa, or against Kansas City rather. That's in a high home run potential game, and he's definitely a top tier option. Vladimir Guerrero, I just said him. Paul Goldschmidt, he is hitting the ball extremely well to start the season. He's already had a home run yesterday. He's got home run potential again in this game, and he is pretty expensive, but he is definitely worth taking a look at. Freddie Freeman's a little bit cheaper on FanDuel here than the other 2 guys I mentioned, so he does have some utility here. He's not as exciting of a play today as Vlad Jr. or Paul Goldschmidt is, but he does have some upside in this matchup. And then if you want to save money at this position, you have 2 really good options. And Salvador Perez, at just $3,200, he definitely has some good upside here. He has homer potential in this matchup, and so does Alejandro Kirk, at $3,000. On DraftKings, they are much more expensive for Perez than Kirk, but over here they're virtually a similar price, and they are both very viable on the slate, and trying to figure out which one of those 2 you could potentially put in utility as well is not a bad way to consider going about it. At second base, we have Brandon Lowe as my core play here. I really do like him today. He's a little bit underpriced here. He didn't play particularly well yesterday, but he's got some really good potential in this matchup, and I think he has some viability here as a pretty cheap play. We're also going to look at Ozzie Albies. He's very similar in price. He's got some good upside. He's had a couple of really good games. He hits the ball pretty well, and so I do think he's in a viable spot here. Gabby Torres for The Yankees also very interesting today, but though he is a little bit more expensive, which makes him a little bit harder to roster, but it does feel like the balls are juiced in New York, and he's definitely a viable candidate on this slate. And then for more value play to pay down some, Whit Merrifield for Toronto. If he draws a start, he'd be a definitely good option at this position, or in the outfield even at the $2,800 price tag. So he's definitely worth taking a look at there. Then we're going to look at third base here, and we have some. It's a little bit harder to find great value here, but we got Rafael Devers, who's definitely a max cost play. He's got really good stuff, really good potential in this game. Plus matchup, everything's going for him, and he looks like a great play on the slate. Nolan Arenado hasn't hit a home run yet, but he's been hitting the ball well regardless. He's had 1 or 2 hits in every game, and he's gotten several RBIs. I look for him to have a great game in this one against Atlanta, and I think he's a viable option on the slate. Austin Riley is a little bit more expensive than him, or actually the same price as him, and not quite as ideal, but he still has some good upside in this matchup. Both Atlanta and St. Louis have stackable teams today, and so they are definitely viable on the slate. And then Matt Chapman is a good, cheaper option at $3,000 to help save some money if you want. He's a very good option. He's got home run potential in this game. He hasn't hit one yet this season, but he's hitting the ball extremely well. Already 7 hits in the first 4 games, and he's been over 12 fantasy points in 3 of the 4. So looks like a really good option on this slate as well. Excuse me. At shortstop, we're going to look at Bo Bichette, who's my core play here at this position. He's played extremely well so far this season. He hit a home run yesterday. I expect him to continue to be a great play, hitting .421, had a hit in every game so far. He's got some good utility here, and this should be a game where the scoring is aplenty. If you want an alternative to him, O'Neal Cruz is actually pretty inexpensive here. He also has home run potential in this game. He is more of a bit robust candidate, but he definitely has utility here. And then obviously in the shortstop range, we also have Tommy Edman for St. Louis, who has some good utility here as a good matchup, good option for St. Louis against Atlanta, and he looks like a very viable play on the slate. When we get into the outfielders, we have quite a few different options here. Lots of different ways you can make a lineup in this one. Obviously, Aaron Judge is super expensive, but he has high-end potential. He's been over 9 fantasy points in every single game, including 2 home runs. I expect him to continue to be really good, and he's got a great matchup. He has all the metrics in his favor, and he just looks like a really solid play. George Springer, also extremely interesting today. He's had one really big game to start the season, but he had 2 bad games against St. Louis, but this is a good matchup for him. He's a little bit too cheap here, actually, on FanDuel, and so he's definitely worth taking a look at. Tyler O'Neill for St. Louis, also very interesting here. He has a lot of upside in this matchup. He's had some really good games so far this season, a little up and down, but he has good utility here and has a good matchup and situation, hits the ball well, and he's a fun guy to roster. Then we're looking at Reynolds for Pittsburgh against Boston. He's got a nice matchup here. He's had some really good games. He's actually hit 3 home runs in the last 2 games. I don't necessarily expect that to continue, but he has some good upside in this matchup, and he's priced in a way where we can definitely afford to roster him. Then we're going to look at Randy Arozarena for Tampa Bay. I do think Tampa Bay is a stackable team today, and he has some good utility, good upside. He's hit a home run this season, hits the ball pretty well. He's got good matchup here, and he's definitely in play. Varsho for Toronto also looks like a great matchup today for him. Despite the fact he's had 2 games over 15 fantasy points, he hasn't hit the ball particularly well so far, but I look for him to have a big game in this one. He's kind of due for a home run, and he looks like a good option. Lane Thomas, also very interesting today, has some nice utility here. He's hit the ball really well to start the season, lots of good contact, just a matter of time before he hits a home run, and typically he will have big games, and when he does that, and he is priced really cheap today, which makes him very viable on the slate. Franmil Reyes for Kansas City, also very interesting today. He's only played 2 games so far, but if he draws a start, he'll be somebody to take in consideration in this matchup. He's got some nice upside, assuming he draws a start. Toscar Hernandez, also very interesting here on FanDuel because he's just too cheap. He's due for a home run one of these games. This is as good a situation as any. He hasn't hit the ball well to start the season so far. As you can see, he's only got 1 hit, but He's cheap enough that he's viable. He's not super expensive like he is on DraftKings, and so he's definitely worth a look. Alex Verdugo has hit the ball extremely well to start the season, hitting 421. He doesn't even need to hit home runs to do well. He's had at least 1, 2, or 3 hits in all 4 games, and that's really good here. He's got good situation, and he's got a plus matchup, and so he's definitely worth taking a look at. And then Masataka Yoshida from Japan, he has really started his season quite well. He a little bit risky kind of play for the first couple games, but in 3 of the 4 games, he's been over 15 fantasy points. He hit a home run yesterday. He's had a stolen base as well. He's getting walked. He does strike out a couple times, but but he has got some good upside here, and I do think he has some great utility on this slate, especially because he's cheap enough here on FanDuel to be rosterable. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. Make sure to check out Discord and stuff like that too if you want. Thank you again for liking, commenting, subscribing, and have a nice day, guys.